and welcome to Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Liu Xin. In this series, I'll dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to my guests to compensate for the missing pieces of the puzzle. It's been 3 long months since I last talked to you on this segment, so hope all is fine. The world is still there, but looking a little different, and those who misinterpret China seem not to have gotten any better, so I'm back. Join me in real time by sending us your comments or questions via the CGTN page on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube or Weibo. If you're watching this live on the CGTN application, email me at thepointwithlx@cgtn.com. Let me know what you think. And as usual, we start our live streaming every Friday at 11 a.m. Beijing time, so do get in touch and we just might read out your comments. Before we start, let's take a look, as usual, at some of the social media comments we've received since last week. Last week's topic was about the major trade deal called RCEP that 15 Asia-Pacific countries signed, including China. Now, Twitter user Sudaha says this is beneficial only to China. Other countries will suffer immensely, just like globalization. They all will have to depend on China instead of being self-reliant in due course. Very dangerous for Asian. However, Twitter user Sudiener seems to have responded to that question. It's China's and every country's right to fairly promote their own trade. No country should lecture China, especially those who have nothing to do with this alliance. China is not holding a gun on anyone, coercing them to sign the deal. India, rightly or wrongly, decided to stay away. All right, this week we're going to take a look at media coverage on China's proposals for the post-COVID world, delivered via a series of major international events this month. Have your media picked up the most important points, fair and square, or have they missed or misinterpreted some things? First, the context. From November the 17th to 22nd, Chinese President Xi Jinping gave speeches at 3 major multilateral events in a row: BRICS Summit, APEC and G20. As leaders met, the world has been shaken by COVID-19, with rising numbers of cases in many countries, economies in free fall, friction between trade partners and political uncertainties. More than ever, countries need solutions and cooperation to fight these challenges. Thus, China's proposals. President Xi put forth a total of 23 main ideas. It's a lot, I know, but mainly they touch upon 2 things: how to fight the coronavirus and how to revive the global economy. On fighting the virus, China called for more solidarity and cooperation by supporting the World Health Organization, for example, establishing an internationally recognized mechanism for health codes, building a global firewall against the pandemic by promoting cooperation on vaccines and making sure the vaccines are a global public good, accessible and affordable to people around the world. Now, the virus respects no borders. Unless people work together, we can't be safe and connected at the same time. What about salvaging the global economy? Due to its effectiveness in containing the virus, China has seen its GDP bouncing back from a dip of 6.8% in the first quarter to a 4.9% year-on-year growth in the third quarter. But being the largest trading partner to over 120 economies, China can't go it alone. President Xi proposed to restore the secure and smooth operation of global industrial and supply chains and harness the role of the digital economy, among other solutions. He mentioned 4 key words: openness, innovation, inclusiveness, and green development. Of course, you would say, and I agree, ideas are ideas. It takes international efforts to tackle international problems, and we have to see whether these ideas work. All right, so against that backdrop, how have the media picked up these messages? Let's take a look at 2 examples, my favorite time. First up, a New York Times headline from November the 23rd reads, "China says it remains open to the world but wants to dictate terms." The subtitle reads, "China's leader Xi Jinping is pursuing a strategy to make the country's economy more self-sufficient while making other places more dependent on it than ever." This is a rather narrow way of looking at things. What China proposes is for countries to continue trading with each other and interacting with each other, but that's been interpreted as making other countries more dependent on China. We depend on each other in this world anyway. China buys over $2 trillion worth of foreign goods for the year 2019, and the amount is increasing. China has held huge import expos for 3 years in a row in Shanghai to buy global. Maybe China shouldn't be doing that because they can, in the words of the authors of this article, make China more dependent on the world than ever. Then there's the issue with the Chinese economy becoming more self-sufficient. Remember the discussion about the U.S. decoupling with China that many have been talking about. It was the U.S. who wanted to decouple from China. Look at the trade war, Huawei, Chinese students, so on and so forth. And these measures inspired China to be more self-sufficient. And now you accuse China of doing exactly that. China would be stupid, honestly, not to. Actually, the authors themselves seem to know this pretty well because they mention it late in the article. Mr. Xi's strategy, of course, grew out of the Trump administration's intensifying efforts to isolate China, which showed no sign of waning in its last weeks. If I were the editor, I would merge the two paragraphs into one, something like, China's leader Xi Jinping is pursuing a strategy to make the country's economy more self-sufficient. His strategy, of course, grew out of the Trump administration's intensifying efforts to isolate China. Who can complain about that? One more thing. Is it necessary to go ideological about everything China does? Look, the article called China's proposals globalization with communist characteristics. The Chinese government promotes the country's openness to the world, even as it adopts increasingly aggressive and at times punitive policies that force countries to play by its rules. Other colorful words such as authoritarian, dictate also litter the piece. Now, which part of the Chinese proposals sound communist to you? Do they mean adopting double standards? Then the United States is probably the biggest communist country in the world. Or does the article say so because increasingly aggressive and at times punitive policies that force countries to play by its rules? Again, the United States deserves that title a bit more. To look at everything through such an ideological lens makes one's head spin, and you don't want that. The article also used trade tensions with Australia as examples of China's aggressive and punitive policies. I would say there is more nuance to the Australian case than the article mentions, and it's not fair to use one case to describe China's trade relations with 120 economies. Next up, a CNN headline from November the 23rd reads, China's Xi Jinping is pushing for a global QR code. He may struggle to convince the world. It's an interesting topic. Personally, as I said during the live streaming, I have just gone through 2 weeks of forced holiday, others call it quarantine, because I flew back from Europe. A big hassle and lots of resources needed. So some kind of smart and safe solution would be great. One of the measures that has been smart and safe in China is a QR code system. Here, almost every space you enter, you need to show such a code. Anyone who has been diagnosed positive or found in close contact with an infected person would not be let in. This system, to my understanding, however, is not popular in Europe or in other parts of the world. So the CNN article does a fairly good job of bringing up multiple issues. For instance, it says several countries have introduced a tracking app technology to monitor citizen movements and potential exposure to COVID-19, including Australia, Japan, and Singapore. But there is no coordination between the systems, and they've had varying degrees of success. The article also points out the positive effects contact tracing can have when it says a study by Oxford University in April found that even if just 56% of a country's population used a tracking app, you would severely suppress the COVID-19 pandemic. But then the article turns its focus to specific concerns about China when it says, given the growing concern about countries around the world about the use of Chinese technology in sensitive industries, there would likely be serious questions about a QR system coordinated with Beijing and how that would function. As if any idea coming out of Beijing poses serious questions. But you know, I can't really complain because there are people who would ask such a question, and there are people who have, in general, a lack of trust in Chinese initiatives. But maybe the article appearing on CNN, such an international media, could point out a few facts as well. First of all, the health code method works. China has the numbers to prove it, both in terms of new cases and the economic recovery that's been made possible that I've just mentioned. Secondly, critics around the world, remember, were quick to condemn China's methods to fight the virus early on. For instance, they called the Wuhan lockdown a violation of human rights and questioned the purpose of travel restrictions. Many said these methods could never be replicated in other countries because they were too extreme or authoritarian. But as the numbers of cases started to rise, many countries did adopt some of the measures China pioneered, such as lockdowns and quarantines, and benefited from them. So why automatically rule out another method that just might help? Looking back at these headlines, how ridiculously skeptical and critical they have been. Finally, President Xi did not tell countries to use China's health codes. No, just that whatever the system is, it should be internationally accepted so that people can start to travel again, business can start to flow again, and families can reunite again. As the article rightfully points out, Xi didn't explicitly say what type of app or QR code system he was suggesting or who would design and run it. So it seems that whenever China pitches an idea, it's automatically dismissed by some, which can harm the process of brainstorming that produces global solutions the world needs. Let's try to take a step back, cast off our prejudices and come together to solve these urgent issues. We can't afford to wait any longer. We'll take a short break, but don't go away. I have 3 guests coming from China and the United States coming up, including a former CIA officer. I'm eager to hear what they have to say about the points I just mentioned. Welcome back, and thank you for sticking around. You have been watching Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Li Xin. I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Chen Hong from East China Normal University, Mr. Cyrus Janssen, Senior Consultant with APP Marketing Solutions, and Mr. Glenn Carle, a former CIA officer. Welcome, gentlemen, to The Point. I would like to start with Mr. Janssen. I was critiquing the 2 media articles about China's proposals for a post-COVID world. I mentioned the kind of almost automatic dismissal of Chinese ideas and the ideological perspective that often international media would like to attach to a Chinese proposal, and the skepticism, the over-skepticism they would have to Chinese proposals. What is your reaction to my comments?
I think it's really important to understand that it's not necessarily, you know, for instance, your example with the QR code and finding a health system that, you know, for tracking people around the world, you know, it wasn't supposed to be meant to be just Chinese, or it's not going to be China powering that technology, but it is what the world really needs right now is to come together, learn to align, and to certainly work together to find a solution. You know, we need to find a way to control COVID, and we need to find a way to, you know, ramp up the global economy. And this is not going to be an individual country's effort. This is going to be a collaboration of all the countries in this entire world coming together to battle these 2 points. And I think that point with this global QR code would be a fascinating thing to have in order to, you know, again, help international travel and help restart these economies around the world.
Mr. Carle, your comments?
I think the issue of the pandemic and the coronavirus and the suggestions that come out of Beijing are probably the strongest points that the President Xi and China have made. The success of the government in controlling the virus, of course, has been notable, but there are legitimate concerns about how to balance individual rights, collective obligations, and then the government response. So I think on finding ways to coordinate on science, on vaccines, on procedures, on travel, as you spoke about your personal experience, which I think is a general one. Now, all of those points are strong, but it is a bit defensive to think that caution and concern about unilateral positions taken are somehow unfairly critical.
Well, Professor Chen, what is your reaction to what Mr. Carle just mentioned, the seemingly defensive nature of some of the attitude or some of the comments that I made? Hello, Professor Chen, I don't seem to hear you. Have you muted yourself? Well, we'll try to get back to Professor Chen in just a moment, but it's an interesting point that Mr. Carle was mentioning about the defensive. I think, you know, it's difficult, Mr. Carle, if you would like to, if you give me a few seconds to react to that, because very often China is on the receiving end of concerns, you know, sometimes very serious concerns and accusations or questioning China's intentions or China's aggressiveness or punitive and all of these big words that were levied on China. So maybe it was defensive, but I think it's difficult to get around it. How do you look at that?
Well, the pandemic is a global, universal, shared catastrophe and crisis. So here we really do have firm ground and opportunity to work together, I think. Unfortunately for all of us, even at the time of pandemic catastrophe, there are a host of other issues where we have frictions, and people on all sides, it's not just two sides, I mean, have their own national interests and their apprehensions. And the world is a tenser place, certainly now, than it was a decade ago. And that is incumbent, really, or due to actions not only by Beijing or by Washington, although we are the two principal players in the tensions, but everywhere else. And they are a reality that there is concern from Tibet and India and Vietnam and the Philippines and Australia and the United States and Beijing for multiple areas where we have different approaches to these frictions, and that spills over tragically into the pandemic too. But they are real.
Is it possible, I'm going to come back to you, Mr. Carle, in just a moment, but Mr. Janssen, let me go to you from a business perspective. Yeah. Maybe business people look at things a bit more pragmatically. Is it possible to set aside these differences, because they aren't going to be resolved anytime soon, that, you know, global leaders and with the help of business communities, non-public sectors, to work on the possible solutions together and think about the differences later? Is that happening?
Well, I think
if not, why? Yeah.
I think it's something that we definitely have to look, you know, strive to achieve. You know, I think when, you know, Richard Nixon, the president that opened up these relations between the United States and China, when he went to China almost 50 years ago, that was one of the things that he said in his speech. You know, we need to realize that there always will be differences, but we need to build on the similarities. I recently watched a speech of Ronald Reagan giving a similar speech in the mid-'80s in Fudan University in Shanghai. Mm-hmm. Same thing. You know, we need to realize there will be differences, but we have to work on the similarities. So I think, you know, from a business perspective, you know, when we're dealing with different countries around the world, you know, at the end of the day, you're coming together to make business work. You know, of course, there's going to be these differences. And I think, again, when we're talking about COVID-19 and, again, getting the global economy back together, you know, like Mr. Carle said, you know, this is a global pandemic. You know, this isn't a China problem. This isn't a U.S. problem. This is a world problem, and we really need to unite together. And I think it's essential that we're going to have to really put away, you know, these differences, you know, and focus on the similarities, because we're never going to have everybody acting the same. That's the reality. And the world would be a very boring place if that was the case.
Let me go back to Mr. Carle. Mr. Carle, I know, yeah, the differences are big, and for some people, they're the only thing. It's unfortunate. Do you see, however, there's anything that can be done? And we take a look at the role of the media in particular, because the media play a very important role. One of the reasons why people can't seem to get over the differences is because they are reinforced. You know, these differences are amplified and reinforced repeatedly on the media, stressing or highlighting the roadblocks that's on our path. How do you look at that?
Well, what I'm going to say may sound ironic coming from a CIA officer, where my profession, my job, was to serve my nation's interests. However, really, and that's a legitimate function for the CIA or for the Chinese equivalent or for any country, is to advance and protect its own interests. However, really, there is a way forward. We all, from every nation, have struggled to make it, give it substance and life, and that is the multilateral approach to various issues. So I think, I'll repeat, I think China's at its firmest and has the best argument when it, as she has done recently, defends and tries to sustain the WHO, the World Health Organization, specifically for this global crisis. There are multilateral agreements and procedures, and Chinese experts work with American experts, work with experts from Botswana on this health crisis. It was a grievous error of the United States, Donald Trump, to criticize and withdraw from the WHO, in particular at a time of global pandemic. So that would be the solution. Similarly, however, that is the solution for some of the other problems that are complicating international relations with respect to the South China Sea or trade agreements. The RCEP agreement is, I think, a positive step forward. There are reservations for it, but these are multilateral approaches rather than refusing to adhere to either WHO or work with the WHO, as the United States has recently done, or say in the South China Sea, as China has done when there was a clear multilateral decision on how to proceed. So I think multilateral is the only way we can avoid clashes.
Let me go to Mr. Janssen. How do you look at what Mr. Carle was just mentioning about the importance of multilateralism? I agree, and yet on the issue of South China Sea, for instance, when it comes to sovereignty issues, you know, borders, whether territorial, whether land borders or sea borders, that also becomes some kind of a multilateralism. I think for China, that is precisely where the problem is. Mr. Janssen, how do you look at that?
Yeah, I think going back to the RCEP, I mean, you're looking at, I'll first address that as, you know, you're looking at a trade agreement that, you know, affects 1/3 of the world's GDP. And you look at how that's going to influence these countries moving forward. About 90% of the tariffs from these prospective countries, you know, will be eliminated within 20 years of, you know, this agreement being established. You know, so that is going to really boost the trade there. There's going to be tremendous, you know, opportunities with that. As respects to the South China Sea, you know, there's so many different things at play here, and of course, you know, there's different countries involved. And I think, again, having always open dialogue and open discussions. I mean, I've talked to many people from Indonesia and the Philippines and everything involved, and you know, I think they've actually been a little bit more reluctant of having the United States having their, you know, warships in that area as well, just for worrying that that's going to just complicate things more. So I think, you know, we need to, you know, realize that there's many countries in play here. You know, I think the key thing is to have some discussion and really, you know, look to work at these, you know, multilateral agreements.
Yeah. Mr. Carle, would you like to react to that?
I don't know that we have so much difference among the three of us, and I hope four of us, if we can resolve the technical problems on this issue. I hesitate to get into, I can't say the weeds because we're talking about oceans here, so to get into the small currents or the details too much of the problem. But in international waters, there should be no question about any ship from any nation passing at any time. That really is the issue. And when there are differences of opinion, as there are among China and the other states that have coasts in the South China Sea or international navies, or be it a clash between Turkey and Greece on how to define their economic zones and territorial waters. really the only solution is to be willing to take the internationally agreed position as opposed to a national one, because otherwise there won't be a solution.
As a matter of fact, China has been talking to these countries, right? They have been trying to come up with a code of conduct that is agreed upon by all countries who have claims to the South China Sea. So that is what China believes is the multilateral approach towards that issue, instead of a verdict by international court, which China does not agree with the legitimacy or the mandate on this issue. But we're not going to go into the details of that. But it seems that both of you, we don't have the Chinese guest for now, both of you seem to see a ray of hope of an opening of more cooperation between China and the United States when we enter next year. Mr. Janssen, is that how you see it?
Absolutely. I'm a very optimistic person, and that's one of the things that I always preach in a lot of the videos and things that I produce is, when the United States and China, learn to work together, the entire world is going to win. And again, I'm an adamant believer in that statement, and I want to make sure that, I think it's in both interests, like you had mentioned, that China is continuing to buy trillions of dollars worth of product from around the world. They have a long-term vision of certainly becoming more self-dependent, which is important, because if you look at the events over these last couple of years, they have every right to do that, but they're always going to be open to new trade, and we see these new deals that are being passed, these new trade agreements. I mean, this is a great opportunity for these 15 countries involved. So I think, and again, I think with COVID-19, this is really going to be the event that really kind of resets the entire world, because, again, we have to figure out two things. We have to figure out how do we stop this global pandemic, and then how do we restart the global economy. Yeah. And again, they can only do that by forging these relationships and learning to work together. Mr.
Carle, are you equally optimistic, or you have some reservations there?
Well, I'm not pessimistic. I don't know if I'm a Pollyanna on it all, but I think that the point that, at least part of the point that you're making, I would strongly agree with. And I would say that is for 40 years, at least for 40 years, the world has experienced one of the greatest successes in the history of international relations, and that is the historically unique rise of China to wealth, prosperity, and power, and integration progressively into what had been closed off to it, or that China had closed off itself to, the global community and economy. So that is the largest story. The clashes that have risen in the past half decade or decade are minor, frankly, compared to that meta success. But as China grows in power, the weight and the balance shift, and the consequences rise for other events, and they too are part of our story now, and they are of concern. But both, it's a truism to say that all parties benefit from international trade and multilateral agreements and efforts to work together.
Yeah, I think on that point we do agree with each other, and on that note I'm going to wrap up this discussion. Thank you so much to our guest, Cyrus Janssen, a senior consultant from APP Marketing Solutions, Glenn Carle, a former CIA officer, and of course still to Professor Chen Hong from East China Normal University. I hope you have enjoyed this edition of Headline Buster as much as I did. Thank you very much for having followed us. As usual, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show anytime, anywhere you want to go. And I'll see you next time on The Point with me, Liu Xin. Bye-bye.